Well, welcome to our studios here in the capital, Tehran. This is PressTV News. Thanks for joining us. French police have fired tear gas at protesters during the fourth consecutive weekend of anti-government protests in Paris. More than 300 people have already been arrested in the French capital. Officials had warned that there would be a zero tolerance toward violence and destruction. More than 90,000 security forces have been deployed across the country to quell the unrest. The Yellow Vest movement began 4 weeks ago against the rise in fuel tax and eventually turned into a general opposition to the economic policies of President Emmanuel Macron. The protest continues despite the government's decision to abandon the fuel tax hike. The live images there from what you see there coming through from Paris shows how widely spread these protests are and how intense they are. As we just indicated, 300 people have been arrested, maybe a little bit more, and there have been clashes, some violent at some points. And you can see here how intense they have been in terms of the police throwing around these smoke bombs or tear gases, as they may be. These are not too pleasant, to say the least. Some of the protesters were on the ground suffering from tear gas inhalation. And we're now seeing objects being thrown around, not just the tear gas canisters. Usually when this happens, then you see storefronts being broken, and that has led to some instances of looting. But this weekend, Paris is in a shutdown mode. 8,000 security personnel is out in the streets of Paris to try to contain thousands upon thousands of Yellow Vest protesters across the country. Up to 90,000 to have been deployed. The French government is bracing itself for 2 days of protest, and so far, no matter what the government has done, has not been enough to quell these protests. Live images there coming through from Paris. Let's take a look at now how intense some of these scenes can be. There's a particular focus on this section here, where majority of these, well, a large portion, I should say, of these protesters have congregated in. Probably because from the shots that we're getting, this is where maybe the most intense exchange is taking place. So there you have the police and their vans, part of the 8,000 that have been deployed across the streets of Paris, and the police trying to maintain law and order, which is very tough in this very charged and energized environment. Protesters want better economic conditions for their lives. Okay, let's bring in Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst. Maybe he can break down some of these events that are unfolding in front of us. Jason Unruhe, it's not just regular protests, I don't think, that we're witnessing there in the streets of Paris, when you have the police as equipped as they are, and of course dealing with the protesters in the form and manner that is at a crisis level. What significance do these protests have for the fate of France, and in particular its French president, Emmanuel Macron?
Well, I think that these protests are definitely going to be the ultimate test for the presidency of Emmanuel Macron. The reforms that he has put through, not just the fuel on the taxes, but also the cutting of pensions for many of the people who have worked their entire lives, is something that has garnered a great deal of hostility towards him. This is possibly one of the most unpopular moves a French president has made in many decades. Some people have compared this to the uprisings in France that took place in May of 1968. But I think that these are a little bit different when compared to those events. Now, this particular uprising is, generally speaking, a righteous reaction to unfair policies that have been put through by the government, and they're the inevitable result of having done so. The French people have a very long history of being willing to rebel against the system when they feel that it's necessary. We had the incident, I believe it was last year, when a migrant man was killed by French police, and there were a great deal of riots that went on for several days demanding that the government do something about it. I think that this has certainly snowballed into something much larger than simply the fuel prices, the fuel tax. In this case, I believe that this is more of an incident where the prices were the straw that broke the camel's back. And this is now encompassing a lot of anger towards a lot of other issues that are taking place in France right now. Not just the fuel price, but the lack of the reduction in pensions, unemployment, many of the other benefits that the French population had. A lot of this is anger towards immigration in the country. This is all a very large, unorganized outbursts, and there can be different people coming in to these protests for different reasons, but they are united in one idea, that they are very angry with Macron for the way that he has run his government thus far. And it's really not looking good for him right now at all. It seems more like his presidency may be in severe jeopardy right now. I would not be surprised if maybe in the next couple weeks, if these protests don't end up subsiding to some degree or another, that his party may ask Macron to step down, and then they'll put another person in his place. That this could be enough to force.
Of course, a lot of the anger is directed at the French president. Is he the target that overruns perhaps anything that the government not only has done but may do? Because even coming into this presidency, which is now 18 months old, he was described as being a president of the rich, and we noticed what happened with tax cuts for the rich, which angered many. Do you think that then his stepping down is going to ease these protests, or do these protesters want more?
I think in the short run, him stepping down would ease them to some degree, because I believe that the next incoming president would probably carry through very much the same policies, probably to a lesser degree. That always seems to be the real test between this kind of use of government and reaction by the public. That the government is always trying to push it just a little bit further, just to see how far it is they can go, and then when they go too far, they scale it back just enough that they can get away with it. So I definitely think that these policies would continue under another president other than Macron himself. I think that he's just setting the stage for these things to happen in the future. These are the general neoliberal reforms that we've seen across much of North America and Europe in general. So I don't see this simply stopping just because Macron is forced out of power, but something that whoever comes after him will be the same one to take up that same kind of collection of policies.
You know, this is obviously the last thing that the European Union needs. I mean, it was not too long ago where we heard about how there's a turnaround in the European Union as a whole. But here we are, and we're noticing what's happening, of course, in France and even in other countries like the UK, of which you're looking at a Brexit situation. It's obvious that austerity measures have not worked. Do you think that there is a real threat now to the unity of the European Union if these protests are meant for anything, for something that is even larger than just a change of government?
I think that this is symptomatic of a larger problem that has been going on with the EU in general. The whole idea of creating the EU was to facilitate trade between the countries in the Eurozone, not having to deal with so many currency exchanges. One united currency with wage differentials and living standard differentials was something that made trade much easier between the countries and allowed them to wield some kind of collective power to compete against the United States, or to try to minimize the amount of influence the United States had on the various countries. But as we've seen, that this united group of European countries is finding it increasingly more difficult to hold themselves together in this situation. That same old antagonism that has always existed, that between the people and the ruling classes, is one that doesn't go away simply because there are neoliberal forms. It's one that is not resolved just by the fact that there's a uniting of the European countries. This contradiction remains in capitalist society and cannot be inherently addressed because of the way the system runs itself. And these largely righteous outbursts of anger are definitely something that's going to happen as a result. We definitely saw the United States was attempting to undermine the European Union as well by funding many Brexit groups inside the UK. It's definitely within a U.S. interest to undermine the power of the EU, to have one less, say, competitor in the global market or the political market, as you may put it. But I think in this overall type situation, there's very much a problem with the EU in that it's trying to deal with many conflicts and contradictions within the society itself, which it's not equipped to deal with. And this is going to eventually break out into situations like these, where there's mass unrest in at least one of the republics, and it may end up spreading to others because of the inherent problem of neoliberalism itself. It seeks to squash as much of the living standards and the livings of many regular people for the benefit of those of the upper classes in order to try to maintain the economic situation. And I think in the end, it's a losing game for many of the elites within the European Union, who will definitely have to resort to greater and greater pressures to try to subdue the public.
You know, the protests have also been criticized by the governments, one of them being that they are being fueled or supported to a large degree by opposition parties. You can mention the party of Marine Le Pen. Do you think that holds ground? Because even her party has not kept it a secret that they do support these protest movements, and they want this Yellow Vest movement to be successful.
Well, we definitely have seen many of the opposition groups coming out in strong support for the riots that are going on right now. But as a question as to whether or not they're really responsible for them, I sincerely doubt this. These are political opponents of Macron, and they're going to make whatever kind of political maneuvers. They're going to take whatever kind of opportunistic actions they can to support themselves in this situation. If we do see Macron or his party end up falling in this ongoing situation, it's very likely that one of his main competitors will end up taking up the mantle of president of France. So I mean, I think it's a case of the people are rightfully angry at a very real injustice that's being done to them through neoliberal reforms, particularly the pension reform that has been carried through. And the opponents, the political opponents of Emmanuel Macron, are simply jumping on this bandwagon to give themselves maybe a populist veneer to try to let the people know that they're on their side in this situation. Now, I don't imagine something as a right side party such as the Le Pen doing very much anything different than Macron has. If anything, heavily rightist parties would be doing them to even greater degrees. So I think this is just mostly political opportunism on the part of many of the opponents of Emmanuel Macron, just seeking to try to maneuver themselves into better positions, try to get a better reputation for themselves among the people of France. And I think I think that's very significant to what's going on right now. The people of France have showed their anger at particular policies that are being carried out by the Macron government. Now, this isn't something that has been crafted by one group or another. This has been a very grassroots uprising that I'm certain many political forces inside of France would probably do their best to try to manipulate in their favor in order to, try to boost themselves in the political sphere as much as possible.
If you want to put a summary of what's going on here, I'm going to try my best, and you please either add or detract from what I'm saying in order for at least our audience to find out which direction this is going. Because, these austerity policies have hurt a lot of people, not only just in France. We can talk about the UK, and of course the epicenter in a sense being Greece. In France, the economy has not been doing that greatly. It's been somewhat stagnant starting from the year, go back as far as 2010. And under Emmanuel Macron, you're looking at a growth of roughly between 2.5%, 2.7%. But the inequality is pretty vast. And at the same time, they have to follow the guidelines for their debt to GDP ratio, which is the EU guidelines. Therefore, if there's going to be a change of government, again, are they going to be able to do anything? That's the big question, because I'm guessing that, what could have been done has already been exercised.
I think that's a very correct assessment. There's only so much France can do within the rules of the European Union itself. We do have to understand that the creation of the European Union was a kind of uniting of many of the ruling classes from different countries within the European Union, so orientated along those lines. I think that it's very convenient for a lot of the governments inside the European Union to say, well, we have to do austerity because these are the rules that we were assigned to, that we signed on to when we became a part of the European Union. So there's kind of a washing their hands of responsibility when the government is really supposed to be carrying out the will of the people. That's what its original function was intended for. So I think that it's all very, it is a contradiction, no doubt, that you can't spend money you don't have. You can't, essentially use a part of the economy that hasn't grown. It's very much, a contradiction in the very system itself. The world hasn't seen much economic growth in the last little while. There have been many small pockets that have seen increases, but overall, coming out of the Great Recession, there has not been the great recovery that would normally be associated in this type of situation. And I think many of the governments around the world are struggling to deal with that right now. I mean, if you in a manner of speaking, you can't pay for a policy or a benefit that you don't have the money to do. And it has been the responsibility of government and business to create that kind of economic growth that would allow them to be sustained. And I think that's going to cause a lot of animosity among the lower classes in society that were made certain certain promises, that were given certain benefits, many of them extremely important to the public, that are very much essential services that are now finding their way to disappearing from the public. As a result of the ongoing economic, frankly, economic crisis going on across much of the world, not just the European Union alone. And I think in dealing with that, the problem is that they need an economic growth in order to sustain itself. And if it's not there, well, then obviously it's not being sustained. And that's a big problem that's being faced by many of the European Union countries, not just France.
Yeah, I don't know if you recall an incident that happened about a month ago. Jason Unruhe, it involved the French president. He was out on the streets. And there was a particular French man that came up to him and said, you know, I'm out of work, I need to find work. And he said that if you just walk across the street, you'll find work. And he referred to jobs in the hotel industry or bars or restaurants. And that video went viral, and it concluded that the French president is so out of touch that he thinks that somebody can just walk across the street and he can find a job. Are instances like that fuel the fire that these protesters have against the French president, which obviously points to a much bigger problem and resonates with them when they do hold the view that this is the president of the rich?
Definitely, he is very much a president of the rich. I mean, I can't speak from any practical experience about France itself, but that seems to be a general thing that has happened in many countries around the world. Many of the upper classes say, well, just simply apply and it'll happen. But we know that this isn't something that's true. We can see how the rates of long-term unemployment have been going up, and they've fluctuated since the Great Recession, but there has been a definite increase in them since before and after the Great Recession itself. Many of these people some of them have been groomed their entire lives for these kinds of positions within government and maybe the higher end of the private sector, who've never had to have a job where they had to go in every day, generally a wage labor, one that barely paid enough to survive. Many of them have never really had to look for a job before. They've always had the connections in business and the higher end of the private sector, who've never had to actually, as they say, hit the pavement and look for a job. And even then, many of those jobs don't pay enough for people to frankly live, because the wages have been going down, costs of living have been going up, and these are not problems faced by many of these people. And that seems to be something that has been true right across the European Union, and it causes riotous situations like the one we have right now. There is very much a definite sense that the ruling classes, the upper classes in many of these countries, are just simply disconnected from the way that average people live day to day. Many of them have been in this advantageous position for many decades, and may not have ever understood what it was like to actually be, a working or middle class person, particularly since a lot of the working in the middle class has been reduced as a result of not just the Great Recession, but also the the neoliberal reforms that have been carried through as well, while many of them destroying many of the benefits that workers have had for a very long time, while the privileges of the upper classes certainly have not diminished in any significant way. And it perhaps it's the thing where if they don't see it, it's not happening kind of thing, out of sight, out of mind. And they still have this idea that there's a very much a different economy than what exists. I mean, I can certainly give some kind of anecdotal evidence. I recall a friend of mine whose father immigrated to Canada in the 1960s, and he said there was jobs everywhere. Like you could literally just walk across the road and get another job, and 1 hour's wages would buy you X amount of all this stuff. So would never be affordable now. And witnessing him even in his lifetime, seeing how this kind of economic transformation has taken place. I mean, I've seen it in my own eyes when I first entered the working world. A several-year agreement had been signed, and many of the manufacturing jobs had been sent to Mexico, and the median wages definitely went down during that time. I mean, I witnessed that myself in my own my own personal experience, my own lifetime. So I think that this kind of thing has been going on, and it's not a real thing in the eyes of many of the upper classes, who have not seen their position shrink or their wages or their salaries go down, but it's something very much that those that they feel are beneath them, that they're disconnected from. And it's, we're always, it reminds me of Marie Antoinette telling them, let them eat cake, or in this case, let them go across the road and find a job, and which would probably be a modern equivalence of that statement.
Yeah, I'm looking, as you were talking, as to another piece of news that's rather important, because it spells out how contagion does take place when you see protests of this magnitude happening in France, and that's happening now in Brussels. Concurrently, you've had these yellow vest protests happening in Brussels. So far, 70 have been arrested there. And they call it the copycat yellow vest demonstrations, but obviously the same message is being put through by these demonstrators. I don't think many do realize how fragile the European Union on the one hand is when you take a look at how it contains so many breakaway regions, not only within France but Spain, parts of Germany. So the European Union really, I'm sure they are paying attention to this. But really, what can be done? I mean, are they going to propose solutions so as to prevent these types of instances happening in other regions across the European Union?
That they're eventually, sooner or later, going to have to address the situation. I don't think that they're going to just be able to forever increase the amount of cracking down on the public that we can kind of see right now. This is definitely, with how widespread this is, the fact that it's now going into other countries in the European Union, the fact that this kind of hostility is rampant in much of the other European countries, some of them taking a very right-wing approach, blaming immigration for many problems they have. I think that there's a very severe fracture that is building within the European Union, and it's not something that they can ignore. If they ignore this, then the European Union could fall within a few years. The loss of the UK alone would be very significant along those lines, and then that might be the first domino, or the one domino that's big enough to knock the rest of them down in a chain if things don't turn around. I think that maybe a lot of the countries in the European Union, they feel that their hands are tied somewhat by EU policy in order to deal with these situations. I'm sure many of the governments there are well aware of the agreements that were signed onto when they became part of the European Union, but perhaps in this case they don't necessarily have the flexibility to deal with many of these situations. It seems the one overall thing that really is the problem is a lack of jobs and a lack of economic growth. If those two things could be dealt with, then we would be having a very different conversation about what was going on right now. The ability to render a lot of these benefits that the society enjoys is a result of the society's ability to afford them, and that seems to be the problem that there is right now, that it simply cannot be afforded. The governance of these countries is what is being called into question. The things are not the way that they should be, and it appears that not just the leadership of many countries, but perhaps the leadership of the European Union in general has not been able to deal with the ongoing economic problem. It seems to be something that is beyond their ability to handle, something beyond their ability to simply legislate, and that has what's led to this entire situation, creating so many of the social disturbances that we see right now. Many of the people are saying they want jobs and they want the benefits that they've had, but they're not affordable. The jobs are not being created due to the economic situation itself. And that's what a lot of the European Union is trying to deal with. But it's a really big question of, can they deal with it or not? I mean, what is there that can be done that can really handle it? And to be perfectly honest, in my eyes, I don't really know what they could do. I think that this situation is a little bit more serious than any kind of general economic contraction that any country ever faces. And frankly, whatever the answer is, it's a bit beyond me. But what's really needed is jobs in this situation, and to return some of the I guess you could say baseline benefits that a lot of the European countries enjoy, in order to stifle this kind of economic situation.
Great, thank you for that. We appreciate it, Jason Unruhe. Jason Unruhe there talking to us from Ontario, looking at live images coming through there from Paris. Tense situation there. These protests are just continuing. 2 days of it is planned. This is the first day, about 4 or 5 hours into it. We've had over 300 arrests to have been made, maybe even more at this point.